And hello. Hello, welcome. We have a post here. 2000, it's November 6th, 2019. Welcome, everybody. Well, and nobody. We'll talk a little bit that I observed over the weekend and some news features of today, some important facts and news features of today, and just my reviews on some things that I actually saw from well, sorry, I got a little interruption there. I watched a couple fights this weekend. There was the Masvidal fight and the Masvidal and Diaz and Canelo and Kovalev, and which were interesting. And then we have some other things to talk about. Obviously, the most imperative story that's happening right now in the world is the Trump impeachment. So I'm going to start with that first because that is the most prevalent feature in the news currently. And the feature in the news is whether or not Trump will be impeached and whether or not he committed any impeachable actions as president. And so, like I said before, I mentioned this before in another post. I'm sure that what he did has been done by countless other presidents for one thing or another. I'm not saying specifically for to help gather dirt on another candidate, but definitely acquire information from another country, possibly inside secrets for any particular thing. I'm sure this has happened before with other presidents, and with the expectation that they would return the favor in some way. This is a non-issue, and I will just go out on the record and say that I don't think that there's any difference between the political parties. I think that the Democrats and Republicans are all cut from the same cloth. They all are essentially working for power and control, and they use the policies to divide the people and distract the people in order to gain as much power and control for their constituents. And obviously, yes, they may have some differences in terms of competition because one group wants control over one particular thing and another group wants control of certain things as well. Everybody wants control over quite possibly the same things or more control. And so therefore they use all of these sort of shiny balls to distract people. A shiny ball would be gun control, gay rights, climate change, just to create sort of these fractions of fractional pieces of society to essentially have people fight against one another. So my prediction is that it's quite possible that Trump will be impeached, but I think I actually mentioned this on a previous post that if he is impeached, it will be at the end of his this current term. So it'll happen sometime at the end of next year, and I mean at the end, like the very end. So when he becomes, well, at the end of his term. So let's say he's got a month left in his term, or 4 weeks, or whenever that particular point in time that happens in the world, where in the presidency, where they're doing more campaigning than actually acting as a president. That will be the time when the impeachment happens, and then he will then run a campaign again and most likely win the presidency. I don't think that the impeachment is going to affect his base at all, and in fact, it'll probably embolden them and actually make more people kind of double down on their support of him. So, I mean, if you think about that, if you think about what I said earlier about the fact that there is really no significant difference between the parties and what the parties want, and if you don't, if you don't subscribe to that idea, that's okay. But think about this for a second. If you look at the national debt as an indicator of whether or not uh, any of the parties actually care about what's happening in America, the national debt has grown with a Democratic presidency and a Republican presidency. Now, we have to do some more, we all have to do some research and uh, try to understand what the national debt actually means, who we owe, and what could happen in the future with that. But ultimately, we're looking at people with the same kind of, like I said, motivators. Something that I found interesting that I read about a couple weeks ago was that people have talked about the probability of a recession and the fact that this, recessions are or the there's ebbs and flows in the market, and that we are in a position now where we're well beyond the normal time frame for us to have been in a uh, progressive market. So at some point, usually it's around 7 years, uh, we have a market turnaround. And I think we're on year 9 or year 10. I can't remember which one, but well beyond the normal precedent for uh, having not gone into a recession. So people are wondering when that's going to happen. But I read something interesting, and it was that Australia and Japan have not had a recession for 20 years. And I think actually one of them is 22 years. I don't remember if that's exactly right, but I know that both of them were around 20 years for not having a recession. And I didn't read specifically um, all the things that they did to prevent that from happening, but I thought that that was an interesting fact. And so you can fact check me on that. And in fact, I recommend that you do, and sort of pass that information on to people, because ultimately recessions start because the public becomes wary of the stability of the economy, and people start doing things with their money, such as pulling it out of banks and putting it in what they can consider safe havens that essentially makes the markets unstable. So the public causes the recession ultimately, even though the people in charge are usually the impetus for the public getting into a position of feeling unstable. So anyway, Australia, Japan haven't had a recession for 20 years. I hope, for the sake of all the Americans that are working and trying to build a life for themselves, that that's possible, and that ultimately it would be great. Wouldn't it be awesome if the 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 politicians actually came out and said, we have the ability to prevent us from going into a recession for 20 years. Here's the plan. This is what was done in Australia. This is what was done in Japan. It actually was these are the people who designed this plan, and we want to see if we can implement that plan here. What do you guys think? And in the meantime, we'll try to solve all of the issues that we're having now over the next 20 years. So maybe even 20 years from now, we won't have a recession at all. So anyway, those are that's some fun facts for you. You can go check them out on yourself for yourself. And my prediction for the 2020 election. Okay, now back to the fight. So there was a fight. There were there were a lot of fights on UFC, and obviously a lot of fights for boxing. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them because I didn't spend a lot of time watching the other fights. Although I heard that there were some great fights on UFC outside of the Masvidal Diaz fight, such as I heard Kevin Lee put on a great performance, and I don't remember who else was purported to have put on a great performance as well. But um, I'd like to see. I'd actually like to go back and watch the Kevin Lee fight, because he's a guy who I feel like really was thrown to the wolves in a way. Maybe because of his own um, uh, aggressive beliefs about himself, but also I think that that company is designed to keep people in line. And if I mean, in reality, if you've spent 20 years in a company and you have connections in all the camps, you could devise a plan or understand what the weaknesses are of each particular fighter and determine from that camp and from spending time or people who having spent time with that fighter exactly how to beat that fighter. So I think this is how they keep their fighters in line. And so I think they did that with Kevin Lee. They weren't ready for him to become a star, or maybe he did it himself. Maybe he tried to move a little bit too fast. But anyway, I would like to watch that fight back, and I'll give my thoughts on that fight. But the Masvidal Diaz fight, I'll just say this: I watched the 4 second or 5 second knockout that Masvidal put on the guy. His name escapes me, but the guy who was the renowned wrestler who got knocked out within 5 seconds after a lot of talk. So that's the only other fight I saw of Masvidal. So call me a fair weather UFC fan. I've seen quite a few fights over the last couple of years. I've been maybe a fan for maybe 2 years and an off and on fan for maybe 4 years. But here's what I think. In the last two fights that I've seen, Masvidal hasn't been tested. Diaz did not look. He looked like actually something was wrong with him. And later on in the press conference afterwards, he alluded to the fact that he had been cut prior to this fight, and also that um, he had a knee injury. And so with that knee injury, he just looked slow. He looked off balance. He looked like he couldn't get any power under his. I mean, he's not a real power striker anyway. He's more of a volume striker, but it's very fluid. And so, and I think what they call him sharp. I don't know if anybody's ever mentioned that he's a sharp puncher, but Masvidal really made him look like he had been off for the 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or whatever the time frame was that he was suspended, or or um, or that he had decided he didn't want to fight for. You could actually see it. He looked like he had some ring rust, and um, he was handled very well during this fight, and he got cut. Apparently, he gets cut all the time. And he said that he could go on, but I think it was great that they stopped the fight. I mean, I guess if he gets cut again in a rematch or a second fight, and if this is what is normal for him, and he doesn't feel like his eye is going to fall out of the top of his eyelid, then it's okay. Then he can continue. But I think it was good that they stopped the fight. I don't think Diaz was himself, and I think he needs to go back and fix whatever issues he has, get back into normal fighting shape, and come back and fight. And I think that if he does, you could see that there was a bit of a change in the end of at the end of the third round. Actually, in the third round in general, and apparently that's his strength, that he tends to turn it on at the second half of the fight. So um, kudos to Masvidal. He looked very strong. He looked fast. He looked crisp. He looked dominant. He looked. I don't know if I said strong, but he looked like a much stronger fighter than Diaz, and he definitely looked more poised and more confident. Diaz didn't look as confident as he normally. Actually, I think he mentioned that he didn't have his confidence because he knew his cardio wasn't where he wanted it to be. So uh, people were saying that they don't want to see a rematch. I think that we should see a rematch because Diaz was not himself, but I don't think it should happen right away. I think Diaz needs to get a few other fights under his belt, and I think Masvidal needs to go ahead and get himself. He needs to rise to stardom because he definitely has the personality for it, and looks like he's put in enough effort and work to be able to handle what they throw at him. at this point, and he deserves to be a star. That knockout that he did of the guy of the that escapes me in his mind. He escapes me because I actually watched him fight in more recently in the last week or so, and he uh, he looked uh, he looked slow. It was weird, actually. He looked really really slow. So anyway, I think he was thinking about retiring. I think he should retire now. Canelo Kovalev. Uh, Listen, I don't know Kovalev. I mean, I don't know him personally. I don't know Canelo personally. Kovalev looked like basically a man who had been at work all day in the coal mine, and then he showed up to fight Canelo, tired and worn out. And Canelo looked like a guy who had just eaten some tainted tacos, and drank a couple of Coca Colas with some extra juice in it, and he looked super big and super strong compared to Kovalev. Although Kovalev, held on for quite a bit of time, there's just no match, and he buckled the fella in the whatever it was, the 10th or 11th round or ninth round or something. So, in me, in my opinion, it wasn't really a competitive fight. I don't think. I think that Canelo still has some problems with. Well, he did in this fight. He still has some problems with defense, or maybe he didn't care about defense because, again, Kovalev had been at work all day, digging coal in a coal mine. So he didn't have the strength to throw any real punches, and Canelo wasn't worried about it. So um, I don't know. It was one of those fights that it was exciting because he knocked a guy out, but wasn't a competitive fight in my opinion. And Canelo got this huge contract, $300 million. So I think they're just going to start lining up people that they know he can beat at least for the first half of the contract because they got to at least be able to get 10 fights out of it. I don't know what the number of fights is, but $300 million. They need some pay-per-views to pay for that. By the way, what do you guys think of? What do you think about UFOs? Well, I'll tell you, I think I'm a big believer in aliens and UFOs. I'll just say that. And I think that, so most recently, the government has admitted that there have been sightings from actual um, military officials that have seen things on radar and personally seen things with their own eyes that were unidentified flying objects. So, but so I felt like, oh, that was confirmation. But then I listened to an interview with Edward Snowden, who had sounds like complete access to uh, military files, government files. He had hacked into the system, and he maybe didn't use the right keywords, but he said he looked for UFO information, hidden UFO information. He didn't find anything. So that was sad because that probably means that there's no evidence of that the government has any UFOs. Now I've watched videos. There's a documentary, multiple documentaries, obviously on Netflix and all over the place. I watched one with a guy who claimed he worked um, in a facility that housed, I think, 9 UFOs. And so, anyway, we'll have to revisit UFOs, but ultimately, I think maybe they don't exist now, which is sad to say. Another interesting story is for you people out there who are in insomniacs like myself, who don't sleep very much and who have difficulty sleeping. It's probably not good because it sounds like it may lead to Alzheimer's. There are a bunch of studies that show that if you get less than, I think, 6 hours of sleep a night, and definitely if you're getting in the range of 4 hours, 5 hours of sleep, that you're going to have some cognitive issues later on in life. and probably will at some point obtain Alzheimer's. And so this new study said, so there was a different study that said that this new study says that the reason why that is because your brain actually cleanses itself after a certain amount of hours sleep, and you have to be at maybe a certain stage of sleep where the brain emits some sort of fluid or uses the fluid, some particular fluid in the body that clears and cleans the toxins from your brain, and some of those toxins actually cause Alzheimer's. So moral of the story is get your sleep. I think it's over 6 hours. You need to get at least 6 hours of sleep. And I've been trying to do that for the last a few months. And I have to say it is beneficial. Last night I went to see a movie. The movie was Black and Blue, starring Tyrese Gibson, and I think her first name is Noemi Harris. The movie, I give the movie a B minus, maybe a C plus. And it was an okay done. I mean, it was pretty well done. I think the sound guy of the movie, and I think that people should pay attention to these sorts of things. The sound guy in the movie sucked. So the guy who actually does the sound for the movie, the guy who puts the mics on the actors and records obviously the dialogue, but also the background noises and creates the various sounds that are needed for the movie. There are some people that are experts at that, and there are some people that are not as good as some of the experts. And the guy for this movie wasn't that great because there were quite a few times in the movie where you couldn't understand what the people were saying, and not because they weren't articulate. It's just that the sound was not captured properly. So I give the sound of the movie a D because that in my opinion, that should not happen. The movie itself actually kept your attention. It held your attention for the full length of the movie. The full length of the movie, they did a great job of keeping it interesting and keeping you kind of dialed in. The acting overall, everybody were all the actors were in terms of performance. If you're gonna, so let's say, Meryl Streep, Robert De Niro, Denzel Washington, Jamie Foxx when he's doing a character, those are all A+ performers. Okay. I give Naomi an A. She stayed in character the whole time. She's from I think the UK, so she has a British accent. She did a great job of controlling that accent and delivering an American accent. And in terms of the delivery of emotion, she was excellent. She held it the whole movie. I think her performance definitely overshadowed Tyrese. I think that Tyrese is a good actor, but he has trouble shaking his persona, and that's difficult. I think his persona is bigger than he is an actor, and sometimes people have difficulty shedding that. And so with that, sometimes I would see Tyrese. Actually, most of the time, I was watching Tyrese and not the character that he was portraying. The other issue I have, and I'm actually from the South, and my family originated in New Orleans. So if you've ever been to New Orleans and you've ever talked to people that are from New Orleans, grew up in New Orleans, especially in the areas that this movie was featured in, and the types of people that were featured in this movie. Now, I'm not saying that they had to do this, but people in New Orleans do not talk like Tyrese and Naomi Harris talked in this movie. And if they couldn't handle the accent because it's a very weird accent, that's fine. They could have at least brought a couple of people in to do that. There are a few things. Like I said, I give the movie. What did I say? Now the more that I'm thinking about it, I give it a C because the villain that they had in the movie, uh, he just didn't seem like a bad guy. I mean, they should have gotten the guy from they should have gotten Juvenile to play that role. That would have been a great role for him, and I think he could have pulled it off. And then they could have used his accent to help other people capture the accent. So next time, casting director, hire Juvenile for your villain. I think he would do a much better job. But overall, the message of the movie was important in that, but a little more sensationalized than I would want it to be. And the way it was purported to be by uh, Tyrese was that it was, sort of this message was necessary for us to hear, and I think it was. But I didn't like. I think they could have done a better job of making it seem more legitimate versus they sensationalized it and more than they should have. But that being said, if you can't get to the movie, it's worth renting and seeing at home. The I talked about the ambush in Mexico yesterday. The most interesting development in that story is that they have picked up two suspects. So that's great. I'd like to hear more about it, and I'm actually going to follow that story because, as I said yesterday, I feel like the story was a bit fishy. There's some things, some facts, some things that are missing, and I'd like to know more about it and know more about these communities because I feel like there's some affiliations that we're not being told about. Well, those are my ideas for today. We're we're going to do a short one today, and thank you for letting me talk.